How do you beat every NES game probably seems like a silly question. You finish the last stage, you beat the final boss, you see the credits roll, right? You may be surprised at how many games on the system aren't as straightforward as that. I definitely was. For a 10-year period, I spent an immense amount of hours playing through every licensed North American game on the NES on original hardware with no cheats or third-party accessories. And I came across dozens of games that didn't fit the typical mold of beat the final boss and see the ending. Some games don't have a well-defined ending. Some games weren't meant to be beaten. Some games have special conditions to meet to trigger an ending. Some games aren't even games at all. Even after years of playing, researching, and discussing how to beat each game on the NES, there's still a handful of instances where there's a lot of gray area and no general consensus on what should constitute a win condition. I'm going to take you through some of the most interesting examples of unusual ways to consider beating a game on the NES. I often say that I beat every licensed NES game when I speak to people that aren't very involved in the NES scene, as it's easier to grasp for the average person. Since you're watching this video though, you're not the average person, and because of that, I'll also be using the term win condition from this point onward, which I think does a better job of describing what I'm trying to achieve when I played through each of these games. Win condition is essentially the goal I'd set for each individual game that I intended to achieve in order to consider the game beaten for my purposes. There are several NES games, or at least we often call them games because they were released on a gaming console, that aren't really games at all. Software like Color a Dinosaur, Videomation, Miracle Piano, Tiny Toon Adventures, Cartoon Workshop, or Taboo, The Sixth Sense aren't games at all. They're learning tools, educational software, or even digital representations of a tarot card reading. So how do you consider something that wasn't necessarily meant to be beaten? I think in the case of software like these, it's fairly clear to see the intent behind them. So to me, using them for their intended purposes works nice and clean as a win condition. Videomation and Tiny Toon Adventures Cartoon Workshop were meant to give the player tools to create a video on the NES. So simply creating a video should suffice. There's no special reward for creating a video of a certain quality or length, so any old drivel will do. Color a Dinosaur is a digital coloring book. The game doesn't offer anything extra to the player, whether they color a single dinosaur in a single spot or fill in every dinosaur completely. As with the physical coloring book, you're essentially done when you choose you're done with it. So as long as you've done some amount of coloring, I'd say you met the win condition for Color a Dinosaur. Miracle Piano was meant as a learning tool to teach players the fundamentals of playing the piano. It was designed as a 4 to 6 month program to be done alongside an instructor, but even without the instructor, it does a decent job of walking you through each of your lessons and offer additional practice modes if you're struggling with a certain technique or lesson. So completing each and every one of the 36 available lessons seems like a reasonable goal for this one. Taboo, The Sixth Sense, only purposes are to offer a tarot card reading to the player and then offer up some supposedly lucky numbers. All you can do here after inputting your birth date is to ask it a question. After that, you'll simply have to click past all the nonsense it spews for a couple of minutes until the program takes you back to the title screen, if for some reason you can stomach another go at it. None of these games have a definitive ending, yet I still feel like they're fairly straightforward in what they expect from the player, making them a bit easier to call beaten than some of the other games we'll go over. Many games on the NES, especially early in its life, were ports of arcade games or games that's design was strongly based on arcade-like experiences. So how do you beat a game like Pac-Man, Donkey Kong, or Joust? These games were typically meant to keep ramping up in difficulty until the player died. The goal for the player was usually to get as far as they could, or achieve a high score on the machine, which could be a personal milestone, or if you were exceptionally dedicated, to have the highest score of any player that had used that specific machine. Some of these games do eventually stop offering players any more game when a kill screen is achieved. These kill screens are not really an ending to the game though, more of a hardware limitation or a point where they stop making more stages for the player. It doesn't feel like these kill screens were ever intended for players to reach, as they end unceremoniously with a software crash or possible level conditions. So while there are some who may argue that a game isn't beaten until the kill screen is reached, which is an incredible feat of dedication to a game, I don't feel like that is necessarily a win condition, and that we can come up with something better. Many of these games have a preset high score. How about achieving that? The problem there is that not every game does have a preset high score. In those cases, would getting a single point feel like a win? That doesn't seem very right either. What happens when you achieve the high score? Anything? It's very rare that getting the high score on a leaderboard rewards the player with something. A game like Pinbot is an example of the high score being a good win condition, as it unlocks the credits for the game after achieving it, but that's an exceptional case. A lot of these arcade-style games get a little bit harder each time you finish all the available stages, often in the form of speeding up enemies or obstacles. What about beating the absolute hardest level in the game? Well, not every game of this style does that, and it's incredibly hard without going into the game's code to find out when that level would even occur if each game offers it. What seemed like the most reasonable answer to me was simply to see all of the content in the game that was made for players to see. That means if a new enemy type, or color of stage, or a musical theme, or stage layout, or player title was introduced, then the developers likely intended for a player to be able to experience that thing. That seemed like a fair expectation to me. So this gave me a relatively consistent win condition across most arcade-style games. It also led to some of the most jarring gaps in difficulty on the NES. But since win conditions don't care about how hard or easy a game becomes, it still seemed like the right way to go. A game like Donkey Kong or Centipede became so easy that it could be beaten in a matter of minutes, while games like Xevious or Mach became a massive challenge to get to the point the game started to repeat content. Some were surprising, like Kicks, which has a different song for the player after each of the first 10 stages. The loop points of some of these games were not always obvious and took some research to properly define. Gauntlet 2 is a great example since it seems endless, but after stage 102, levels begin to repeat. With 102 unique levels, it's very easy to not even recognize the game's repeating if you didn't know that before you started. But even with this win condition, to see all the content, there's still some gray areas. If you told me you'd beat Urban Champion by playing 138 rounds on the 3 lives provided, half of which were against the toughest CPU the game has to offer to earn the coveted rank of Champion, I'd say, yeah you did. And if you told me you'd beat Urban Champion by winning 3 fights against the easiest CPU in the game before the stages started looping, I'd also say, yeah you did. It seems pretty unlikely they meant for the game to be such a test of endurance and tedium, yet that champion title does exist, so it's hard to argue against it. So in those cases, I always erred on the side of caution and did the harder or longer win condition just to be safe, even though it may not be necessary. After all that talk against high scores, it turns out that it did make sense in some cases. Like the previously mentioned Pinbot, the game locks its credit sequence behind a set high score of 9,983,270 points. Similarly, Rollerball's Skyscraper mode has a credit roll hidden away behind a scoring threshold as well. If you score 1,000,000 points or more, then when you're finished playing, if you wait at the title screen after your game over for about 30 seconds, you'll be treated to a credit roll after the high scores are shown. But there are also many sports compilations on the NES. In a lot of cases, seeing all the content in these games would mean just playing each event once, even if you lose, since no further stage is typically locked behind your ability to win at an event. That doesn't seem very in the spirit of a sports competition. I'm referring to games like California Games, Caveman Games, or Skate or Die. Most of these games are meant to be played against friends, and nearly all of them have a preset high score or times to beat in each event. With the one exception of that damn Winter Games. The rest of them give me a target to achieve, a modicum of effort involved, and in a few cases a nice medal ceremony. And since a bronze medal is still a positive outcome, I do feel like any medal should count as meeting the win condition when it's applicable. Like most of the sports compilation games, many of the single sport games on the NES were intended to be played with friends. However, some do have lengthy single-player seasons that act as a campaign to overcome, and typically have some kind of victory screen for winning the season. Those ones are straightforward in terms of a win condition. Finish the season or tournament in first place. But some sports games, like Wayne Gretzky Hockey, or black box sports titles like volleyball or baseball, don't have seasons. And the only thing to really do as a single player is beat a CPU team. And the result won't change whether you beat them on the easiest or the hardest difficulty, so many of these types of sports games end up being quite short and simple to finish. Some golf games on the NES also end up being incredibly simple due to the lack of a preset score to beat, CPU opponent, or any kind of defined in-game goal other than playing all the holes, and thereby seeing all the game's content despite what your final shot count may end up as. What if a game can be beaten in more than one way, and more than one of these endings seems definitive? When you leave Caesar's Palace with $140,000 or more, you leave in a sleek red sports car. And if you leave with $20, you'll head home in a taxi. Are you a winner in either case? Yes, you are. Does it really make a difference how much money you had when you left? I don't feel like it really does. And games like The Three Stooges and Die Hard have multiple endings that can be earned depending on how and when you end these games. But at both of those, as long as you meet a certain threshold, you'll get a positive ending. So in cases like these, I simply felt it was good enough to call a game beaten by avoiding the negative ending and earning one of the several positive endings to the game. And sometimes, a game like Snow Brothers, for example, has two endings, both of which are good. One is just a little gooder than the other. Either seems fine though, so if you want to test your skills and beat the game without using any continues for the best ending, great job, you did it. And if you're okay using some of the 4 available continues, then great job, you did it. This one is more or less based heavily around Ghosts and Goblins. I've never spoken to another person who felt that you'd beaten Ghosts and Goblins by finishing only the first loop of that game. It seems pretty unanimous that there is both a screen teasing that you didn't get far enough on your first run, and a more definitive victory screen waiting for anyone daring enough to beat the game twice, back to back. So why would I treat games like Magician, Kickmaster, or Balderdash any differently? I couldn't think of a great reason. But even here, there is absolutely some more gray area with a few games. The Legend of Zelda, Super Mario Bros., and 8 Eyes are all great examples of this. Both loops on The Legend of Zelda are proper endings, but the second one just seems slightly more final or definitive, so I opted to include that as my win condition. And in Super Mario Bros., the second quest offers the same ending as the first one, and the content isn't new at all. It's simply remixed. Should that be required to call it beaten? 8 Eyes has 3 loops. The first 2 are pretty straightforward, but the third loop of this game is really unique. Nothing in the game, the manual, or the packaging will give you access to the final loop of the game to get that final ending. The code to access it is hidden in external materials, such as an issue of Nintendo Power, or a few of the plethora of tips and tricks books that were available during that era of gaming. I think the case could easily be made to exclude the third loop because of that, but for completion's sake, I do feel like the third loop should be required. Most of the time, when you have a difficulty setting, it doesn't affect the ending to a game. Good examples of this are the sports games we talked about, and strategy games as well. Whether you set the CPU to level 1 or level 5, you'll have the same results when you reach the end of your season or campaign. However, there are a few games that don't follow that trend. Double Dragon 2: The Revenge won't even let you access the full game without playing on Supreme Master difficulty, and your adventure will be cut short to an earlier stage in the game if playing on any other difficulty setting. Playing Rampart or Gun Knack on any difficulty lower than the hardest option will give you an end screen that teases the player that you didn't actually beat the game and suggests that you can only truly succeed if you play the game through to the end on the hardest difficulty that the game has to offer. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Tournament Fighters also won't give the players a credit roll unless they go into the options before playing the game and crank the difficulty up to hard. Difficulty-related win conditions are uncommon, but they do appear often enough that it's worth your while before starting a game to look into it so you don't have the disappointment of a false ending when you finish a game for the first time. Games like Castlevania 3, Dracula's Curse, or Advanced Dungeons & Dragons Hillsfar offer players a variety of choices in the character that they can play with. These characters can drastically alter the content and even an ending of a game in some cases. Ultimately, I decided that the goal was to beat every game, not 100% every game. So with that in mind, it felt okay to me to consider a game like these beaten, even if there was more to do if I were to choose to start again with a different character. I handful of games have multiple modes or objectives and therefore require multiple win conditions. Games like Best of the Best, Championship Karate, and Pirates have more than one objective during the same game and require multiple conditions to be met during a single playthrough. This can mean you may be able to achieve one win condition but fail another at the same time. These tend to take a bit of planning in order to ensure all conditions are met in one playthrough. And other games like Skate or Die 2, The Search for Double Trouble, or Hogan's Alley have more than one mode available at the title screen, which will require each mode to be played and beaten completely separately. When making rules for these win conditions, most things fell into place nicely. But when dealing with hundreds of games, there was bound to be some games that didn't fit into any category nice and cleanly. Let's use Star Force as an example. In Star Force, when you beat stage 24, the game rewards you with an advertisement. And while that doesn't feel like any kind of an ending, it is something for your effort, I guess. But there's also a 25th unique stage after that, which offers you absolutely nothing for beating it, and simply keeps looping you back to the start of stage 25 until you eventually run out of lives. I opted to choose the win condition as beat stage 25, but I wouldn't argue with anyone who felt like stage 24 was sufficient. Other games like Sky Kid and High Speed have unusual win conditions that aren't replicated in any other game, so they had to be singled out. In Sky Kid and stage 26th, if you're able to grab the bomb and carry it through the stage long enough to reach the mothership, and then successfully drop the bomb on the mothership, which is no easy feat to do, you'll be rewarded with a happy ending cutscene, and then start stage 27, which is just a loop of stage 1 again. If you fail to do any of that, there will be no landing pad at the end of the stage, and you'll be forced to crash into the sea. In High Speed, there's a series of minigames you can activate and play, and once you've played through all of them, you'll have the opportunity to launch a spaceship off the table. Now, if you can survive long enough to do all that a second time as well on the same playthrough, you'll get a message telling you that you've beaten the system this time. It is quite time and skill intensive, but it does seem like a good goal built into the table for players to achieve. Despite mentioning and highlighting over 40 games in this video, there are still dozens more that weren't mentioned and aren't straightforward to call beaten. Hopefully all of these examples have given you a clear idea of just how muddy the term beating a game can be when it comes to NES games, and gives you a bit more perspective when someone like myself tells you we've beaten them all. There are at least 3 other players I'm aware of that have made the same claim that they've beaten the entire NES library, and from what I can tell, we all have slightly different perspectives on the subject. I don't think any of them are clearly wrong or invalid. Sometimes the ending just isn't obvious and is going to be left to player discretion. But at least the next time you hear a friend say they beat Arkista's Ring, you can push your glasses all the way up your nose and tell them, actually, if you only beat the first 31 stages of Arkista's Ring, you're only a quarter of the way through the game. If you were to beat 4 loops of the game, so 124 stages in total, you'll get a thank you message and a character stat screen, which is the actual ending of the game to consider it truly beaten. And only then will your friend truly appreciate having you in their life.